Today we're going to discuss critical theory activism versus humanist activism. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with critical theory, it's a school of thought from which wokeness was born. So most people are probably more familiar with the term wokeness or woke politics. So the school of thought behind wokeness is critical theory. I'm not going to be critiquing critical theory as a school of thought today. I am going to focus more on the physical manifestation of critical theory activism. I think that critical theory as a school of thought does have some merits. I think that it has some benefits to viewing societal issues through that lens, but I think it's very limited, and I think when applied to the real world, how it's applied, it has the exact opposite result in what it claims to achieve, which is social justice, essentially. The reason I'm doing this is because I consider myself an activist, and I'm often at odds with what mainstream activist has come to be. At odds to the point, not where I could even call it a light disagreement, I am gravely concerned that activists are causing society damage instead of doing what they're meant to do, which is elevating society, elevating disenfranchised people. I think they're doing the exact opposite, and it's becoming more and more mainstream. Institutions are starting to adopt this set of beliefs, and even people who aren't familiar with critical theory or wokeness are starting to adopt some of these, what I consider to be problematic assumptions. Now, there is no clear term for what we're describing. The most common term is wokeness, but other people would describe it as the radical left, the regressive left, the intersectional left, cultural Marxism, postmodern neo-Marxism, that's a Jordan Peterson term, or you may have heard wokeness, wokeism, or woke politics. Its proponents are often referred to as SJWs or social justice warriors. The reason there's no clear term is because proponents of the set of beliefs have not named themselves. Let's look at something on the opposite side of the spectrum, which would be alt-right. Alt-right is a terminology that right-wingers gave themselves. People who subscribe to critical theory activism have not given themselves a name, so these descriptors have been given by opponents of the ideology and not proponents of it. Now, generally when we want to describe an ideology, we shouldn't use the terminology given by the opponents, but we're not left with much of a choice because its proponents have not described it. For the sake of this presentation, I'm going to refer to it as CTA, critical theory activism, and perhaps I'll use wokeness here or there. Now, before we get started, I do want to clarify that progressivism is not the same as wokeness. They're often conflated, but they're quite different. Progressivism is a form of left-wing politics that's generally focused on policy change, primarily socioeconomic policy change. Bernie Sanders, for example, could be considered a progressive. He's not quite woke. Wokeness, on the other hand, is a very performative form of activism. It's a lot about virtue signaling and focusing more on cultural change more than policy. It's true that there is some focus on actual structural change. The more radical of that movement, they would like to deconstruct and reconstruct entire institutions or perhaps even the entire system. There's been some talk of rewriting the Constitution, for example. So that is not just cultural change, that is actual, you could call it policy change. What I would say is that they don't have a coherent policy plan. They don't lay out clear policy positions in which people can rally behind. Now, I'm going to show one quick tweet which kind of sums up the difference between progressivism and wokeness, and we kind of laughed about this here on Discord, but it's about Bernie Sanders. I'll admit the Bernie memes are funny, but his openly grumpy disposition during a very historic moment for women, and particularly women of color, speaks volumes to me. So Bernie Sanders, a lifelong progressive and activist, and again, you don't need to agree with his politics, but I find it hard to view someone like that as a bad actor or nefarious in their intent. And this person who tweeted that, they don't see Bernie for who he is or what he's done. They just view him as an old white man, and they're assuming the worst about his intention. They have no way of knowing why he seemed grumpy. He could have been cold. He could have felt sick, had gas. We don't know, but they assumed the worst about them. So that shows a clear difference between progressivism and wokeness. The focus of this presentation is going to be oppressor versus oppressed, this duality framework that's quite prevalent in CTA. There were a lot of different angles that I considered taking, what aspect of it I want to talk about, but this duality, the oppressor versus oppressed framework, and the different set of rules and expectations of these two groups is what I think is one of the most concerning aspects of CTA, so that's what we're going to focus on. Now, what is the purpose of activism? I think first we should define this. First of all, to bring societal change. Women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement. This was people coming together, fighting for change, and succeeding. Activists came together and bettered society because they worked together towards a common goal. Now, there's another reason for activism which I think is less commonly spoken about, but I would also give it some importance, and that's meaning. People get meaning for fighting for something greater than themselves, being part of something larger than themselves. Today we live in a world where we have perhaps less meaning than ever before, so if people can have an outlet, join some kind of a movement, join a community, and that empowers them, well then that's great. So I would even say activism that doesn't actually have positive societal change but gives people meaning, that in itself has positive societal outcome. So we could still view that as positive. The problem, though, with CTA or wokeness is I don't view it as ineffective. I view it as counterproductive. I view it as actually very harmful. So I don't accept this as just being for meaning. I view it as highly problematic and worthy of being addressed the way we're doing right now. Also, it's worth mentioning that activism has taken a new form because of social media. Most activists are keyboard activists, and there's definitely benefit to spreading ideas on social media. But people often do it. It's a form of virtue signaling. They like the credit they get. They like the likes, comments, and shares that they get. And we've really come to the point where most activists today are really echo chamber activists. They're speaking to people who already agree with them, and they care more about how many likes and comments they get, but rather than how many minds they change. So a way to know if your activism today is effective is it changing minds, not is it getting likes and shares? That's something to keep in mind. The goal of activism and of CTA, presumably, is to not have an immutable characteristic, whether it's gender or sexual orientation or race, put you at a disadvantage. And this is certainly a commendable goal, one I think we could all agree on, and one I'm willing to fight for. I'm willing to rally and fight to elevate those who are at a disadvantage due to some immutable characteristic or some other injustice. Without a doubt, commendable. The question is this activism progressing this goal? I'm under the assumption that it absolutely is not. In this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on the racial justice side of CTA because I think it's the most prominent. I think the issues with it are clearest, and I think the negative impact it's having is the most obvious. Now, it's important to say that a lot of what I learned about CTA, I learned from black activists. Before I felt like I can speak on any racial issue, I said I'm going to learn about racial issues. And to me, it made sense to learn from black thinkers, black activists, black intellectuals. It was through my inquiry into this topic that I understood why it's highly problematic. Sure, there's many black thinkers and activists who are proponents of CTA, but the ones that I discovered that were against it made a lot more sense to me, and they convinced me more than anything that this approach to racial justice is highly problematic. Now, there's something in the framing often when someone like myself who's white passing speaks on racial issues. I can understand why it can cause offense or why people would be closed off to hearing it. As a Jew, I always cross-reference my thoughts with Judaism because I could relate to it personally. So if somebody was giving a presentation on anti-Semitism, I could understand why many Jews would not want to listen to that or would be offended by it. But it's important for me to explain that I'm not speaking against a black movement. There are some black people and women and people from the LGBT community who are proponents of this approach, but there are many who are against it. So I am simply supporting black activists, LGBT activists, women's rights activists who are against this ideology. the framing that it is a white versus black way of thinking, it's wrong and deceptive. And the best way I could think to describe this is, if someone were to criticize Kahanism, that would not be anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. That would be criticizing an ideology which is fundamentally flawed. So what I'm doing today is I view equivalent to a non-Jew criticizing Kahanism. Let's get into the topic, binary framing, oppressor versus oppressed. Now, the fact that it has such a strong binary built into it is one of the reasons why it's attractive and spreads. As we know, the human mind loves simplicity, and things that are dualistic in nature will often be more appealing. We see this in many aspects of life, good versus bad, good and evil, right versus wrong, with us against us versus them. The brain is very dualistic, so this is an ideology that plays well into the psychology. Who are the oppressed? Who are the oppressors? So the oppressed are generally non-whites, also known as people of color. Now, it is selective because Asian Americans are not considered people of color, and I think it probably has something to do with the fact that they're doing very well socioeconomically, so they are generally not considered oppressed. But oppressed are people of color, women, and the LGBTQ community. Primarily, there are some other smaller groups, and the oppressor is the white patriarchal capitalist system and their beneficiaries, primarily white men. Now, I view this as the first major red flag to this belief system because that has a very strong sense of in-group, out-group. It has a very strong sense of enemy, and the enemy happens to be another group of people, and that group of people are decided by skin color and gender. So again, immutable characteristics, and if we actually think about what racists have been doing, it's exactly that. It's creating enemies based off immutable characteristics. Now, I do realize that people who are proponents of this ideology do have a justification for why that is, but the manifestation of it in day-to-day does come out in the form of viewing a whole group of people in a negative light, and it shouldn't be hard to understand why that's probably not healthy for building good societal ties amongst all members of society. Now, there is one way white men can become accepted, and that's by becoming an ally, right? So how do you become an ally? An ally means you accept all parts of this belief system and don't question it. Your job is not to share thoughts, it's to listen and comply and support the dominant narrative. I would consider myself generally an ally because one, I do recognize myself as someone with immense privilege, and I want to work to help make the world a more just place. I'm willing to work alongside disenfranchised people to create a more just world. But because I disagree with this set of beliefs, many who adhere to woke politics would not consider me an ally because we are in disagreement. Now, in order to better understand the framing of oppressed versus oppressor and where it comes from, we need to look and understand how they view privilege and the view they have of privilege. And you'll often hear that white privilege or check your privilege, right? So the way that the conversation about privilege is had is generally under-nuanced, and it's done in a very accusatory way, trying to create guilt in the people who they're saying need to check their privilege. It's not done in a nuanced way. They're not trying to show that privilege is multifaceted and layered, because aside from skin privilege, there's socioeconomic class, there's what country you were born in, were you born in a two-parent household or not, were your parents nurturing or abusive, are you good looking, are you tall, are you right-handed or left-handed? All these play into your privilege. But if you're going to hear the dominant narrative of CTA, you are not going to know that all this plays into privilege. You're going to be under the impression that your privilege is decided by your skin color, and only that, and perhaps your gender as well. Again, white privilege exists. I'm not denying that. It certainly exists. But if we want to actually understand an individual's privilege, we need to look way beyond the color of one's skin. And just to kind of back up this claim, it's the obsession we have with talking about skin color privilege. I did a quick Google search, and all the searches I did, I put in quotations, so it's finding those words exactly and not similar, like not just one of the words, they're looking for the full phrase. So white privilege has nearly 5 million results. And then I looked up class privilege, socioeconomic privilege, height privilege, and all the other types of privilege that we mentioned. They don't even reach 2 million. So one type of privilege alone, white privilege, has 3 times as many mentions as all other types of privilege put together. We can see that it's a bit of an obsession on specifically skin color privilege, and that does not give people an actual nuanced understanding or realistic understanding of what individuals go through. It will give you the impression that a white person by default is privileged, and if you're not white, then you're by default not privileged. This is harmful for society for so many reasons. Let me give a quick example. Would you rather be a middle-class black woman or a poor white man? I've never been either, so I can't know for sure what it's like to be a middle-class black woman or a poor white man. But if I were to have to guess, I think I would go with the middle-class black woman, that she would have more privilege. It's true that a middle-class black woman is going to face struggles that the poor white man never will, without a doubt. But she'll have more access to opportunity. She'll come from a family that probably has better connections. She could get to a better university. She could travel. She could take more risks. But if you hear the dominant narrative about privilege, you will never assume that a black woman could ever have more privilege than a white man. This is just a clear example of how it gives us an unrealistic understanding of society and how privilege works. Now, I do think it's great to acknowledge one's privilege, not because we should feel guilty of it. It's just clear that gratitude is very important for people. So definitely acknowledge your privilege. I try to tell myself every day what I'm grateful for. I was born white passing. I'm a male. I was born in a middle-class family in a first world country. I'm alive in the 21st century. I have loving family and friends. In a sense, I'm one of the most privileged people ever, and I'm super grateful for it. I don't feel guilty for it. It shouldn't be used in an accusatory way. It should be taught to us in order for us to elevate one another. So I am for the conversation on privilege, but certainly not how it's being had today. Now, let's get more into the 2 different sets of rules and expectations. If you are the oppressor of the oppressing class, white men primarily, then you're going to hear the word accountability. You need to be held accountable. You need to work to elevate others. You must. It's not a suggestion. It's not trying to make someone feel like they should be responsible for the greater good. It's accountability. It's you must. It's about making them feel guilty for what they have and kind of pressuring them to do something about it. If somebody from the oppressed class perhaps misgenders somebody, uses the wrong terminology, or is perhaps racially insensitive, then they definitely must be held accountable and they must be even canceled, right? This is the narrative. Now, if you are an oppressed person and let's say you act hateful, maybe you loot a store, maybe you act violently, well then we must understand that you are acting as a result of your conditions and your oppression. We must understand that. Here's the thing. Both these narratives are getting at something true. We are all products of our environment. Whether you're a white supremacist or a looter, you were not born that way. It was your conditions that turned you into that. So having empathy towards people who grow up and achieve bad outcomes is important. We need to understand that had we been born in their shoes, either a looter or a white supremacist, we would be them. But at the same time, accountability is a very important societal construct that helps people make a better decision next time. So whether you're oppressed or whether you're of the oppressor or oppressed class, accountability is important and so is empathy. But these sets of rules, and again, this isn't there's no written sense of rules, but this behavior is abundantly clear if you speak to people who subscribe to this set of beliefs. 2 completely different set of rules for 2 groups of people. Here's the thing about that, and I know this is not intentional, but essentially by saying that the oppressors are the ones who must be held accountable and only them, they are essentially attributing a higher level of agency to white people. This is one of the strongest white supremacist tropes that exists, that white people have a higher level of moral agency, that they are the ones that are responsible for their actions. This is exactly how colonialism was justified. This is how not letting women or black people vote was justified, because white men were the ones with agency. So it's ironic and sad that those who are claiming to fight white supremacy are using one of the strongest white supremacist tropes. They obviously don't know that's what they're doing, but that's exactly what they're doing. What are the implications of this set of rules, of teaching people that society is split into 2? Some are oppressed, some are oppressor. You have no say in which one you are. Now, I'm sure there's many outcomes how an individual internalizes this, but I think there's a few most likely outcomes. If you're the oppressor and you're told your whole life that you're the privileged one, that you need to work for somebody else's cause, if no one ever shows empathy towards you as an individual, if you're constantly being judged by the color of your skin, obviously that will create resentment, as it's created resentment in oppressed people, right? A lot of the anger that comes from oppressed people, something similar is now being done to the people deemed oppressed. But this isn't how you fix society. This just makes the situation worse. So when you experience this narrative, it's bound to create resentment. Resentment doesn't make you want to become an ally or hear other people or be empathetic towards other people. It makes you more defensive. It makes you more closed off. It makes you angry. Now, what's interesting is America is going through a demographic shift. White people are becoming the minority, and it seems like a lot of the reason why Trump was very popular was a result of white anxiety because of a demographic shift. Some would like to oversimplify that and say it's just racism, but I think no population is comfortable going from a majority to minority. So I think their anxiety is natural. There's probably even a biological explanation to it. Again, I'm not excusing racism. It certainly exists. It's prevalent. It should be addressed. But the anxiety is natural, and one of the single best ways to help a population go from majority to minority without that anxiety is to let them know that there's nothing wrong with being white. So the exact thing that we should be doing to be lessening white anxiety, we're doing the exact opposite. We're strengthening it by making it seem like there's something wrong with who you are because of the color of your skin. It's very obviously the wrong approach here. I view woke politics to be the fuel that is the fire to white supremacy. It in many ways fuels it. It strengthens it. In addition to causing resentment, I think in some people it might not cause resentment, but it's bound to create some kind of a superiority complex. When you say you are the one with the power, it's your role to elevate the weaker people, you begin to internalize that and think it's kind of like a white knight mentality. You view yourself as superior to others and others as weak. I think that is also a quite likely outcome to this narrative. So resentment and superiority complex seem to be the most likely outcomes of this narrative for those deemed the oppressor. Now, when you're of the oppressed, what's the most likely outcome? Well, first of all, it tells you to identify with your oppression. It's not just to acknowledge that you are oppressed or come from a historically oppressed group. It tells you that oppression is part of your identity. It's who you are. This breeds what I view as a victim complex, which is very disempowering. It gives you the feeling that you are not in control of your future. You're not in control of your destiny. You need other people. The white people need to come, and without them, you will never be liberated. It essentially gives you the impression that you need other people to come and do the work for you. Disempowering disenfranchised people is essentially taking power out of the hands who can most benefit from being empowered, right? There's no disagreement that there are people who are at a disadvantage because of their skin color. It's true, but these are the people who need the tools for self-empowerment more than anything else. And I'm not suggesting self-empowerment is the only tool. We do need systemic change, but systemic change does not come at the expense of helping oneself. It comes in addition to helping oneself. It's also important to understand that being oppressed is not entirely an objective reality. Sure, there's aspects of it that are objective, but a lot of it is a subjective mindset. I'll give two clear examples. You have Chloe Valdry, who is a black woman and a brilliant activist. She's one of the activists who is speaking a different tune when it comes to anti-racism. I learned a lot from her. She would not consider herself oppressed when, based off this framework, she gets double oppression points, right? She's a woman and she's black, so she's oppressed 2 times over. She does not consider herself oppressed. And then you have some white men, let's say, for example, a Trump supporter. Some of them might feel like they're oppressed by the government, the high taxes, the media is corrupt, the global elite. They feel like they're genuinely oppressed. So how can you have a situation where a black woman feels liberated and a white man feels oppressed? It's because oppression is often a result of a subjective feeling rather than an objective reality. Let me use Jews as an example as well. I'm Jewish. I come from historically oppressed people. We faced horrible and horrific oppression, persecution, and a Holocaust. Anti-Semitism is still prevalent. I don't consider myself oppressed in the least bit. As I've mentioned already, I consider myself extremely privileged. Not all Jews agree with me. Many Jews consider themselves to be oppressed. There's full Facebook groups dedicated to Jewish oppression where they talk about how difficult their lives are. I think it's important to call out anti-Semitism when we see it, but there's a difference between being able to acknowledge problems in society that need to be addressed and taking on the identity of an oppressed person. An identity of an oppressed person holds you back when these are the people that most need to be elevated. So again, systemic change should not come at the expense of people working to elevate themselves. It's one of the single best tools to elevate disenfranchised people. I want to show a few photos just to show that whenever I speak out against this, people will say, oh, but it's just a fringe group on Twitter. You're representing the most extreme in the group. Well, I want to show some photos that show that this is in our institutions, that it's affecting people's lives, that it's very real. This is an article about Emmanuel Caferti. He's a Mexican-American. He was arrested for holding the OK symbol, which is also a white supremacist symbol. He was holding it out of his car casually. People thought he was doing a white supremacist symbol. They called his work. He was fired. A Mexican-American. Here's AOC holding up the same symbol just to show that it's a natural symbol that sometimes people do, and we should not assume the worst about somebody because they hold up that symbol. Brett Weinstein, he's a great thinker, someone who I've learned a lot from. He was a professor at Evergreen University. Some of the students decided that they're going to have a day of absence, and that day of absence means white people do not show up to campus. Brett Weinstein, who is a lifelong liberal, he refused to accept this and said, I will show up because I don't think that's how you solve racism. I think that contributes to racism. His class was raided by the students. He was threatened physically, and he was forced to resign. Why? Not because he did anything racist, because he had a different approach to dealing with racism. This is Yusra K. Ali. She's the co-founder of BLM Toronto. This is, I'll just read a few lines from her Facebook post. Whiteness is not humanness. In fact, white skin is subhuman. All phenotypes exist within the black family. All white people are genetic defects of blackness. I don't need to go on, but it's clear that if a white person ever wrote this, that it's detestable and they should be condemned and probably banned from Facebook. But because it was done towards white, it's considered okay. Again, not everybody who subscribes to critical theory is going to say that this is okay. Let's make that clear. But the fact that this is given a freebie shows that the level of accountability you have for certain people is close to none. Here's a BuzzFeed article, 37 things white people need to stop ruining in 2018. And then it says in small, first of all, America. Let's just change the word. 37 things black people need to stop ruining in 2018. Detestable. Obviously, there should not be an article saying that. But if it's white people, then BuzzFeed will give it a pass. Again, a different set of standards. A proposal, this is an article, there was a proposal for race-based housing sparks debate at New York University. Some students actually proposed that first-year students, that black students will have their own dorms. They essentially proposed segregating housing units in university. Thankfully, this was not accepted. It was shut down by the university. But just the fact that this was on the table and demanded shows a serious problem in the direction we're taking activism. For a set of beliefs to survive and spread, it needs a certain set of qualities, but one of the qualities is either it needs to make a lot of sense or it needs to have a built-in feature that doesn't allow you to question it. So religion's a perfect example. You can't question the Word of God. And this is very convenient because there's a lot of iffy metaphorical truths that the only way that they hold up to scrutiny is actually if you can't scrutinize them. So CTA has a similar built-in mechanism that they're generally not open for conversation. And you're going to hear there's many ways they shut down the conversation. But what I've personally gotten told to me when I tried to raise concern about this is that it's white fragility. There's no way I could disagree. If I'm not fragile, I must be fragile, or I need to check my privilege. Or sometimes they will just throw out things like racist or transphobe or sexist. For example, there's debate now about if trans women can play women's sports. Now, whatever your opinion on this is, it's not transphobic to see an issue with that, to be concerned that if trans women were to play in sports, that would not be fair to biologically born women. That's not a radical position, and it's nothing against trans people to hold that position. It's just being honest about reality. Now again, you could hold the position that they should be allowed. I'm not making a case one way or another, but it's clear that to disregard that claim as transphobic is obviously just shutting someone down and implying the worst about them instead of actually engaging with them. So again, if you raise concern, your disagreement will cause them to assume the worst about your intention. In addition to that, this activism is devoid of policy. If we look at activism from the past, it was all very focused on policy. Women's suffrage was to give women the right to vote. Civil rights movement was to end segregation. This activism is quite devoid of policy. If you look at the one policy that was most mentioned, it was defund the police. Now, what's interesting about defund the police is how unpopular of a policy position it was. They did one polling that I saw of Black Americans, and the majority of Black Americans do not support defunding the police, believe it or not. And it's actually not hard to understand why less police presence in Black community ends up harming many Black Americans. So it's not a popular policy position, and this is the one that was most spoken about by Black Lives Matter, for example. Let's talk about some great policy that will definitely elevate disenfranchised communities, and one that most Americans already agree on: ending the war on drugs, reforming how public schools are funded. Currently, your public school is funded by the property tax of your neighborhood, meaning if you come from a poor neighborhood, your public school is going to have less funding. That's extremely classist and obviously holds poor people back. That's not equal opportunity, not at all. Let's reform that. Massive prison reform, massive investments in impoverished communities. This is something that it won't be hard to build a consensus across the political aisle on. The reason I focused on these is just for that reason. I'm not saying it's intentional, but it's very convenient for the political parties that Americans are fighting one another, that Democrats view Republicans as the enemy and Republicans view Democrats as the enemy, that white Americans are scared of Black people and Black people are scared of white people. This is convenient because it stops us from unifying around actual policy positions that there's already a consensus on. They'd rather us fight on social issues than unify over class issues. And not only if we were to unify around these issues can we actually bring lasting change, but working together towards this change can very well be part of the much needed reconciliation process between white America and Black America. Are there some policies that are not socioeconomics or not involved with prison reform that are actually race-based that are needed? Perhaps. I'm not making a case against that. But there are many policy positions that would tremendously help the Black community that does not include defunding the police and that there is a broad consensus on. Why is there no talk about that? In addition to policy, it's true that some of the issues can't only be fixed with policy. It seems that there's also an implicit bias issue. When you have the majority of peoples in a given institution be white or white men, and white people have certain biases, all people have biases, but let's say white people have certain biases about Black people, or men have certain biases about women, and the majority of people in an institution look a certain way, that is going to put people who look another way at a disadvantage. There's no denying that. The issue is we don't quite know how to solve implicit bias that already exists. Implicit bias training has been shown to be ineffective, but implicit bias comes from someplace. We're not born with it, so we need to find where it comes from. If it comes in institutions like the mainstream media or in movies and songs, then we should call it out to fix it. We should build a society where children aren't being born with implicit bias. And we can also teach students in school about implicit bias, but in a nuanced version, including all types, not just, as we mentioned, whites having all the privilege, Blacks not, because that seems more than anything to strengthen the social construct of race and strengthen the implicit bias that we already have. The amount we focus on race and the categories we give these groups seems to strengthen implicit bias more than anything else when we should be work to rooting it out. And humans, as we know, we are flawed animals in many ways. We have a tendency to generalize and put people into groups. We categorize people. A lot of group hate comes from just this, group generalizations. One of the single best ways to defeat this is from a young age to teach children to view the individual above all else. That if you see a Black man, you don't know much about them. Sure, you might know their gender and the color of their skin, but you don't know so much about them until you get to know them as a person. Above all else, we need to teach young people to view the individual, to raise them with compassion, to tell them to call out hate when they see them, and that we all have not accountability, but a communal responsibility to help those around us when we can. I'll leave it with a quote. It's not the direct quote, but by someone who has greatly influenced my activism. Essentially, what we need to do is judge people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. MLK was so profound and his work was so revolutionary. It saddens me that today's activism has gone so far from the values that MLK put forth. I truly believe that we activists have the ability to transform the world. We must lead with compassion by elevating those around us, uniting and not dividing all the inhabitants of this earth. And I truly believe we could have a transformative impact. Thank you all for listening.